I would like to acknowledge the generous support of Dean James Schiffer of our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and the multiple co-sponsors and volunteers who have worked very hard these past couple of weeks to make this event possible. We are also thrilled to welcome those who are watching the live stream of today's event. Today, we celebrate the legacy and life's work of historian, activist, and playwright Howard Zinn, an historian who made history. In his landmark 1980 publication, A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn gave us a radically new way to tell and to interpret American history. Reacting against conventional historical narratives which had always given the impression of a gloriously and coherently unfolding series of triumphs and progress, Zinn privileged the perspectives of people at society's margins, to use his characteristically provocative words, the slaughtered and the mutilated. Zinn's retelling took aim at the heroes of high school history textbooks, defiantly forcing us to confront the genocide of Christopher Columbus and the deep racial failings of Abraham Lincoln. Zinn's vision had mass appeal for the American public, and he played a pivotal role in our nation's most important grassroots struggles for social justice since the 1960s, most notably around the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. Few are better qualified to reflect on Howard Zinn's relevance to social justice in today's world than our two distinguished guests. Both were close personal friends of Howard Zinn. Professor Noam Chomsky is an author, philosopher, and activist. At the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he is Institute Professor Emeritus in the Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. Beyond his revolutionary work in linguistics, Professor Chomsky is internationally recognized as a vocal critic of U.S. foreign policy, the neoliberal turn of global capitalism, and mainstream corporate media. We are also joined by Anthony Arnove, writer, editor, and filmmaker. Anthony Arnove collaborated extensively with Howard Zinn, including writing and producing The People Speak, a documentary film based on Zinn's people's history and screened on this campus just a few days ago. Arnove has also collaborated with Professor Chomsky, editing the 2008 volume, The Essential Chomsky. Our plan for today is as follows. During our first hour, our speakers will each give presentations. During the second hour, they will respond to questions posted on this event's Facebook page and submitted by you, by the audience today. So we'll have questions from Facebook and questions submitted by you, the audience today. If you haven't seen them already, keep an eye out for note cards being passed around. If you are inspired, write down a question. At the end of the presentations, we'll collect them all and cover as many of them as we can. We ask that you be concise, respectful, and legible. Those of you in the overflow areas, and we understand there are several overflow areas, can also submit questions. Don't be shy. So without further ado, please welcome our first speaker, Anthony Arnove.
Thank you so much for that introduction and for all of you for coming out to honor Howard. It's so beautiful to see the outpouring of interest and excitement and enthusiasm around Howard's work, not just here today in New Paltz, but really at Occupy encampments and struggles and activities around the country. It was so moving to hear that at Boston Occupy, people were calling the library there the Howard Zinn Memorial Library, and the lecture series there was named after Howard. And of course, it's bittersweet to be in this moment of such exciting possibility and upturn in struggle, of people coming into motion, of people protesting, of people organizing, because Howard was so loved to have been among the people taking part in all of these demonstrations and activities. He would have been so inspired by the creativity, by the dynamism, by the energy, and it's really bittersweet to think about fact that he can't be here, but he is yet at the same time so present. So present in the way in which people have honored him, like they've done in the Occupy Boston, present through his ideas. So many of the people's libraries around the country report that their best borrowed or most often stolen, actually, title in the People's History of the United States. You see people with slogans on their banners, their handwritten slogans, quoting Howard, taking quotes from his books, taking quotes as well from our film, The People Speak. And there's nothing automatic about that. There have been moments in history when people have gone into activity, have gone into struggle, and haven't necessarily had the same reverence for or understanding of the work of those who came before them, and the same kind of respect, and haven't drawn necessarily the same kind of inspiration. So to see Howard inspiring people, to see Howard finding new audiences today is really remarkable. I mean, it's phenomenal that Howard had the impact he had within his own lifetime. Even more phenomenal to see the impact he continues to have on new generations of people. So I wanted to share a few stories of the very lucky period I had of collaborating with Howard. Just a few that illustrate some of his remarkable character as a person, and really what made him such an inspiring example today. The first story I want to tell comes from my first conversation with Howard. Of course, I knew Howard's work. I had read People's History of the United States, seen lectures, had read other of his books, and had, in fact, in some cases, traveled hours to hear him speak at campuses like this. But we had never met. And then one day, I was working at a small independent publishing house in Boston called South End Press. And I happened to pick up the phone, and Howard's very distinctive voice was on the other end of the line. And this was, a little bit unexpected. Of course, I recognized Howard's voice, but I wasn't expecting him to be calling South End Press that day. And the reason for his call was that someone who he had corresponded with in prison and visited in prison for more than a decade was being released. And Howard was calling around to find work for this friend of his who he had visited and supported through all those years of incarceration. And that's exactly the kind of radical Howard was. He always put into practice his ideas, his ideals. And he was always very concrete and committed to the people who he saw himself in solidarity with, struggling alongside of. A few years later, I had the privilege of working with Howard to do a book of interviews called Terrorism and War. And they were interviews that dealt largely with the U.S. Efforts at that point abroad in Afghanistan, particularly in Iraq, the beginning of those occupations, and Howard's clear, principled, early opposition to those occupations. And during that time, Howard called me, and he was very excited because the night before he had been invited by Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam to come on stage at a concert at the Boston, they changed the name of it, but someone here I'm sure can remind me of the name of the big Fleet Center, exactly. And Eddie Vedder had invited Howard on stage, Eddie having been so inspired by Howard's work and wanting to give Howard a platform and introduce Howard to the many fans who had come out to hear Pearl Jam that night, but also wanting to give Howard a platform. And Howard said to me the next morning, "I gave the best speech of my life. It was only 3 words long, end the war." And that really was so poignant because Howard never made anything complicated that was simple. He spoke with such concision, such clarity, and I think that's part of why he was able to reach so many distinct audiences. with a very radical understanding of history and of our role in making history. So it's partly through that influence, through his connection to people like Eddie Vedder, through, of course, his connection to Matt Damon, who put the brilliant line in Good Will Hunting, in which Matt Damon's character and Robin Williams' character talk about two books, A People's History of the United States and also Manufacturing Consent. That very poignant moment in that film, and then of course there were other moments in popular culture. The Simpsons included a drawing of the People's History of the United States. Later on, The Sopranos, who have an episode that opens with a shot of the People's History of the United States, and have a whole episode constructed around the conflict around Columbus. But it's partly through that way in which Howard's ideas entered popular culture that this interesting milestone happened when I was working with Howard on that book, Terrorism and War, and beginning to work on another book that came to be known as Voices of a People's History of the United States. And the milestone was that A People's History sold its 1 millionth copy, which was remarkable at the time. This is in 2002 at the time. It's now sold more than 2 million copies. And you know, this is a book that was published in 1980, not a moment of leftward change in our culture. In fact, a very inhospitable moment. It was published in a first edition of 5,000 copies.
Wow.
And so to have now infiltrated so many different aspects of our culture, and to have so many teachers surreptitiously introducing it into their classrooms, even though, of course, we know that they're increasingly being required to teach to test and having less and less control of the curriculum, yet they're finding these creative ways to introduce Howard's text to their students and to bring it into the classroom, even when it's not officially sanctioned to do so. It achieved this first milestone of 1 million copies, and HarperCollins, who was Howard's publisher of that book, and as you might know, a corporate and commercial publisher, called Howard and they said, well, we're very excited, this milestone's happening, we want to do something to commemorate the fact that you've reached 1 million copies. And what we've come up with is this idea of we'll have a conference of historians who will sit around and discuss the impact of your work, and maybe we'll have people read passages of the People's History of the United States. And Howard said very quickly, I'd rather drink poison. And he said, I have a far better idea. People who read my book say to me over and over again that what's so inspiring are not my own words, and of course, as he would joke, as wonderfully written as my own words are, but the words of the people they encounter from the history of dissent and protest in the United States. Eugene Debs, Fannie Lou Hamer, Frederick Douglass, all of the people who are excluded from our traditional education and our traditional textbooks, and whose voice comes across so eloquently in the People's History of the United States. I know that was certainly my experience, growing up, going to public school in Indiana, knowing nothing about Eugene Debs, the great socialist and labor organizer and agitator, one of the most eloquent and important organizers in our country's history. And he had lived in Indiana, grown up there, ran for president of the United States 5 times in the state of Indiana. Not once in my public school textbook did I come across the name of Eugene Debs. It was only when I came to A People's History of the United States. And so Howard understood that, and he said we should get people together and have people read the words and perform the words of the people themselves. And that was partly also Howard's understanding of the importance of art, the importance of the collective experience of coming together, creative expression. And so we organized in 2003 our very first performance with Kurt Vonnegut reading Eugene Debs, with Alice Walker, with Patti Smith performing People Have the Power. And it was a tremendous experience, and it really confirmed Howard's sense of how important it was to give voice to these people in our past who have struggled for whatever freedoms we've achieved in this country. And a couple years after that, we were doing some of these performances around the country, and we were at an auditorium in Los Angeles, a beautiful auditorium, the Japanese American Cultural and Community Center. We had a great reading that night. And a very funny thing happened that I think gives a little bit of insight into Howard's personality. We narrated these evenings of performances from Voices of the People's History of the United States. Howard would sit at one end of the stage, I would sit at the other, and then we just give a little bit of a context, a paragraph or two about each of the performances that the audience was going to hear. And the sound engineers at the auditorium didn't realize that something was going on that became very apparent when we listened to the audio recording of the event afterwards, which is that they were leaving Howard's microphone on during the readings and performances, which was a very sweet thing at the end of the day, because you could just hear Howard's joy and glee and his visceral reaction to every one of the performances that night, even though he was so familiar with those voices. He had heard them before, he had read them, he had written about them, but there was something so original, so fresh in his groans of glee as people were performing these pieces was just remarkable. And then, of course, later on, we learned that we had to tell the engineers ahead of time to make sure Howard wasn't mic'd when he wasn't introducing people. And the process of working on those live performances of Voices of People's History of the United States led us to the process of working on this film, The People Speak, which I was so privileged to work with Howard on. And we started the filming of The People Speak in Boston at the Cutler Majestic Theater at Emerson College over the course of 2 days. And I just want to share 2 stories from that. The first was a very funny moment. We had a break in between a morning taping session and an afternoon taping session of these live performances that we were filming for the documentary. And Howard was a great fan of Dunkin' Donuts, famously addicted to their coffee and donuts. And so Howard wanted to steal away and get a Dunkin' Donuts coffee. Of course, we had coffee backstage. He could have just gone to the green room, but he wanted to go out to Dunkin' Donuts. And we were on a film set, so there's PAs and there's cameras and sound people, and he's mic'd. But okay, we're going to go to Dunkin' Donuts. And so Viggo Mortensen, who's in the film, decides he wants to come along with Howard to Dunkin' Donuts. So we go to the Dunkin' Donuts, it's around the corner, it's a small shop, and we walk into the shop, and then suddenly there's a kind of a nervous flurry of activity, and this woman gets out her camera phone, and she wants to have her photo taken, but she doesn't want to have her photo taken with Viggo Mortensen. She says to Viggo, "Excuse me, sir, could you take a photo with And that was a world as it should be, where it's not movie stars, but historians who we admire and respect. And of course, Viggo shared that sentiment completely. And later that weekend, we had a press conference. And Viggo Mortensen was there, and some other people were in the cast, and Howard said something that I'll never forget. He was talking about the experience of working on this project, and he said, "I haven't had a feeling like this since I was part of the Civil Rights Movement. That feeling of solidarity, that feeling of being part of something, that feeling of being part of something far more meaningful than your own individual career or satisfaction." And to have been part of giving Howard a bit of that sense was so exciting and important to all of us. Because really, Howard conveyed, as no other person I know, the joy of being an activist. That there's no better life, no more fulfilling life than one lived in struggle. Howard wrote a piece that was about Eugene Debs. And after Howard died, we had a memorial in Los Angeles where some of the people who had been involved in the People Speak and in Voices of People's History gathered for a kind of a private performance, where that night, instead of reading from Debs and Truth and all the people whose words had been part of the performances we had done in Voices, we had a program of only reading from Howard's speeches and letters and his books. It was a very moving evening. People were brought to tears many times, but really the most memorable moment of that evening came for me when David Strathairn read from Howard Zinn talking about Eugene Debs, and I just want to quote something that David read that night. These are Howard's words. "We're always in need of radicals who are also lovable." And what he said about Debs is that we need to learn from him, quote, "a determination to hold up before a troubled public those ideas that are both bold and inviting. The more bold, the more inviting." And I think really that just says it all about Howard. Bold, inviting, the clearest ideas that he held up, and the attraction that those held for so many people. And I want to end really just with another thing that Howard wrote that I came across recently. It's from a book called Post-War America. It's actually a textbook that he wrote for a small publisher, well not small publisher, but a publisher that's not well known today in Indiana, an Indianapolis-based publisher. And at the end of that book, he was writing about social movements of the 1960s and the 1970s. And he had this to say. He said, "In post-war America, it was beginning to be recognized by a small but growing part of the population that the special qualities of control possessed by the modern liberal system demanded a long revolutionary process of struggle and example. The process would have to be long enough, intense enough to change the thinking of people." And I think that idea of struggle and example really sums up so much of what Howard's life was about. His commitment to struggle, the fact that he himself was an example to us of a life lived in struggle. And he goes on to say that his hope is that through free associations of people engaged over a long period of difficult struggles with entrenched power, democracy would come into its own at last. And I think really in this moment of Occupy, that vision is something that is so vital and so urgent that we fight for today. Thank you.
I neglected to ask earlier that you please turn off your cell phones if you haven't already. And now it is a great pleasure to invite to the podium Professor Noam Chomsky from MIT. Please welcome.
Couldn't give a class at Boston University without hundreds and hundreds of students showing up. The administration there loved him so much that they finally threatened that unless he was kicked out of his department, the department would not get even a paper clip. So finally, Howard retired and went on to a greater thing. Well, whenever I think about Howard, which is quite often, particularly in the last few months, for obvious reasons, there are words that of his that always resonate in my mind. They're his call to focus our attention on his words, the countless small actions of unknown people that are the foundation for those great moments that ultimately entered the historical record. Without the countless actions of unknown people that created them. That's a fundamental truth of history. And it's one that his work, and in fact his life as well, did a great deal to illuminate, to bring to our understanding. It's no exaggeration to say that he literally changed the consciousness and also the conscience of an entire generation. It's no small achievement, and it continues and expands. Well, this particular event could not have been better timed. It's, of course, taking place in the midst of countless small actions of unknown people who are rising. I'm talking, of course, about the remarkable Occupy movements now. There are by now several thousand in the United States and a couple hundred countries elsewhere. These are the first real reaction, first real challenge to the effort to reverse what has been a severe assault on the general population of the United States in the past generation. Counterparts throughout the world are reacting to quite similar assaults. A major exercise of bitter class war that's been worldwide, centered in the United States, spread throughout much of the world. And the similarities are real. So just take what's maybe one of the most dramatic, Tahrir Square. Now that's not Zuccotti's Park, of course, but no less the uprisings share many salient critical features. They have many of the same roots. In Egypt, Mubarak, the dictator Mubarak's programs, neoliberal programs, they followed the rules of the famed Washington Consensus, established by what's sometimes called the IMF, World Bank, Treasury, triumvirate, world governance. And they had the same devastating effects that they had uniformly. They created a great deal of wealth, but in very small sectors of the population, they severely harmed much of the population. Inequality soared. There was massive corruption, increasingly brutal repression of workers, others who tried to defend or obtain elementary rights. Virtually up to the moment of the Arab Spring, the World Bank and the IMF were issuing glowing reports of the remarkable achievements of Egypt's economic and political managers following these principles coming from Washington. That's again a routine practice. It's happened over and over up till right before the edifice collapses, as of course it regularly does. And all of that is quite familiar here. Maybe hard to remember it today, but Alan Greenspan, the head of the Fed, who was called St. Alan in his glory days. Just a few years ago, he was being hailed by professional economists as one of the greatest economists of all times. He presided over a miraculous economy, that's called the Great Moderation, in which all fundamental problems had been resolved thanks to the triumph of the market, the miracles of economic theory. And also, as Greenspan proudly explained to Congress, thanks to growing worker insecurity, which reduces pressures for compensation and decent working conditions, which quite obviously are worthy features of a healthy society and a healthy economy. And meanwhile, very much as in Egypt, wealth concentrated in the pockets of a fraction of 1% of the population. For the majority, real income incomes stagnated, often declined. People try to get by with increased working hours, far beyond other industrial countries, unsustainable debt, and asset inflation, meaning temporary paper wealth from the regular bubbles that all disappear when they collapse. It's been a regular feature of the economy ever since the Reagan years, when the New Deal regulatory apparatus was dismantled. During the earlier period, 50s and 60s, great growth period, no financial crisis. But in the 70s, the economy shifted dramatically to financialization, enormous growth of financial institutions, and offshoring of production. All of this related to fundamental changes in the economy, among them the decline in the rate of profit in manufacturing here, which directed capital to other directions. That's what happens in undemocratic societies where investment and other decisions are not in the popular hand. The basic facts are too familiar for me to review, so I won't do it. And the last few months have indeed witnessed the first major popular reaction to a vicious period of vicious class war. That's the Occupy movements in New York, and very quickly spread. And shortly before them, and in part inspiring them, the dramatic developments in Egypt and the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, may not sometimes called. Well, not surprisingly, right now, they're all facing repression worldwide, partially coordinated. It's of different kinds in different places, but the general tendencies are strikingly similar. Just as the global assault on the past generation has been similar in many of its aspects. Well, for Howard, I'm sure that the rising up of countless unknown people and their many actions, all of this would have been the fulfillment of a dream of a lifetime of passionate commitment and devotion, and another vindication of lessons that he worked very hard to convey to us, to impart to us, about how we can progress towards a more civilized world. That's the way it happened. There are, as Anthony mentioned, there are regular Howard Zinn memorial events in the Occupy movements, Howard Zinn libraries, Howard Zinn memorial lecture series. I was privileged to give the first one of those in the Occupy Boston movement, but they're all over the place, and with very good reason. There is nobody who did so much to inspire these movements. It's a tragedy for all of us that Howard's not here to invigorate them in the way he did for so many years, and to help direct them on a constructive path. That's not going to be easy. They've been a tremendous success, but the tactics have a kind of a half-life. You can pursue them for a while, but after a while they begin to have diminishing returns. It's necessary to think about how to modify them, keep the principles in mind, not be too wedded to the tactics, and go on to do other things. And it's, I think, clear what kind of things have to be done now. It's not going to be easy to do it. It's also necessary to deal with the obstacles that are going to come up. And systems of power don't wave goodbye cheerfully. They have many means to protect themselves. They have plenty of experience about protecting themselves. Unlike the popular movements, which keep coming up anew without historical memory. It's particularly true in a highly atomized society like ours, where there haven't been sustained movement. Whatever you thought about the old Communist Party, there was one good thing about it. They knew they weren't going to win quickly. There was always going to be somebody around to turn the mimeograph machine the next time the demonstration started. We talk about the civil rights movement, we think about the 60s, but it started in the 30s. In fact, it's way back before that. It was really taking off in the 1930s. Some victories, a lot of defeats, but you keep at it. And small measure because of things that Howard was doing, his support for others, his participation. Actually, the first time we spent any long period of time together was at a civil rights demonstration in Jackson, Mississippi, back in the early 60s. You may remember or know about what those things were like. Well, that's Howard did. One of the things he dedicated a lot of his life to was to try to overcome this lack of historical memory, and made a lot of inroads, but it's a task that really has to be pursued intensively with the recognition that victory is not going to come fast. You make it small reforms, power systems can co-opt and accommodate and modify, but if you want to have longer-term changes, you have to expect substantial, hard, dedicated commitment over a long stretch, and it can achieve goals, but not easily. Well, there's another striking point of comparison between the Arab Spring and the Occupy movements here, and that's the aspiration that kind of inspires all of them for authentic, functioning democracy. There are differences. In Egypt, say, the effort is to try to gain elementary democratic rights, which had been blocked by the U.S.-backed dictatorship and still are. In the United States, the effort is to try to recover the rights that had been won over centuries of struggle and have been beaten back. At least to do that, and I say at least because the victories that had been attained, which were certainly real, were nevertheless partial. And if you can recover the ground that's been lost, and that's not easy in itself, you should be able to go far beyond that. Well, we all know about the way in which the democratic system has been shredded during the neoliberal period. One familiar fact is the spectacular rise in the cost of elections, with its obvious consequences. It's estimated to be about $3 billion for the next week. Only one place to get $3 billion, and that's what's going to be determined. So party platforms and media and the execution of them. The U.S. isn't Iran, where candidates are vetted by the clergy before you can vote for them and get a democratic vote. In the United States, they're vetted by concentrations of private capital, and then you get a vote. It's a difference, but not a dramatic one. Increasingly, financial capital, in recent years, financial capital has grown astonishingly. A small part of the economy back in the 1970s, right before the 2008 crash, it was about 40% of corporate profits. It's doubtful that it does anything for the economy. In fact, it's probably harmful. But it is remarkable, and power, both economic power and economic power, yields political power almost automatically, so that it leads to legislation that accelerates this vicious cycle we've been living in. There's more to it than that. Another aspect, not very well known, studied by a really outstanding political economist, a close friend of Howard's, Thomas Ferguson, he's studied the way power has shifted within Congress. It used to be the case that if you wanted a position of influence in Congress, say, chair of a committee, it was attained by seniority and service, essentially, not 100%, but that was the principle. So that's disappearing. It's now, as Ferguson has shown, it's now increasingly the result of paying money into the party coffers. Well, one way to get the funding that buys you the chair of a committee or other position of influence, and that's the same corporate pockets that the candidates are reaching into to be elected. And a lot of that is, that kind of thing has a lot of consequences. One consequence is this tragic comedy of the Republican debates. The last couple of months, and people can't believe what's going on. There's never been anything like it in the history of parliamentary democracy. Recognize that there's a certain inevitability to it. It's not just happening because they're weird people. It's a consequence of the fact that a couple of decades ago, the Republican Party abandoned any pretense of being a conventional political party. It's now just a party of the super rich, a term which you're not allowed to use. There's a contemporary Orwellism. You're not allowed to say wealth, you're supposed to say job creator. Job creator. That is that tiny percentage of the population which is sitting on mountains of cash. It's so huge, they don't know what to do with it. But they do know what not to do with it. Great jobs. There is a striking feature of the Republican non-party is that it has a definite party line, which makes the old Communist Party look flexible. Certain phrases, and among them is job creation. If you don't say that, you're out of the party, you're not funded, and so on. Well, it's that has effects. I mean, if an organization, a political, electoral organization, is solely working for the benefit of the super rich, it has to get votes somewhere. And you can't get votes by saying, this is what we do. So it's necessary automatically to appeal to tendencies in the population, which have always been there, very attractive tendencies that are around. And in the last couple of decades, they've been increasingly mobilized. Religious fundamentalism, ugly nativist tendencies, hatred and fear. These things get mobilized and you have to appeal to them. You get Republican debates, you get other things in not so recent history, not so ancient history that are not very attractive. I'm old enough to remember them personally and real knowledgeable enough to know that's a serious matter that shouldn't be overlooked. However, one definite principle of the party line is that those who are super wealthy have to be protected from the indignity of having to pay a fraction of taxes, but not the dreams of having to pay the taxes that they did during the great growth period of the 50s and 60s, maybe partly like the 90s, which was not that bad. But meanwhile, their share of national income, tiny fractions of percent, has reached unprecedented heights, and correspondingly, the share of the national income among working people has reached unprecedented lows. It's the ones who still have jobs. Well, these are things that are happening right before our eyes. We have a business party that monopolizes elections, has two factions, and the other faction, who are mostly what used to be called moderate Republicans, who are called Democrats. All of this is an indication of the deterioration of functioning democratic forms. They become more and more forms, less and less substance. Well, one index of how a democracy is functioning, how it's actually functioning. One index of that is the relationship between public policy and public will. In a democracy, you learn in 8th grade, the public will determines policy, and whatever, there's always a gap, and the character and scale of that gap tells you something about what's happening in the society. Well, there's a gap now. It's not a gap anymore, it's a chasm. It's never been like this. The difference between a very heavily polled society, for a lot of what people think. And the gap between what people want and what's talked about in Washington is astonishing. I mean, you can see it in the front page every day. There is a topic that overwhelms Washington. That's the deficit. You have to focus on the deficit. Well, the public has opinions about that. The public doesn't regard the deficit as a big problem. They regard the big problem as jobs. I think they're right. The deficit may be a problem potentially down the road. It's not a serious problem now. It's obvious from the way financial markets are functioning. But for the bankers, the deficit's a problem. So that's what you talk about, the deficit. Well, let's keep to the deficit. How do you deal with it? The public has opinions. Overwhelmingly, the public thinks you should increase taxes on the very rich, and you should protect benefits from any attack. The financial institutions and the ultra-rich think the opposite, so therefore that's the way it's going to turn out. No taxes on the very rich and cut away the benefits. In fact, you've probably seen the leaks that came out from the Deficit Commission. They indicate that the Democrats have been moving towards privatizing Medicare. Now, if you think of it, that's supposed to cut the deficit. Actually, it increases medical costs for very simple reasons. The private sector is far more inefficient and far more costly. So if people can shift from Medicare to the private sector, private insurance, that increases medical costs. Of course, many of them can't afford to shift, so it doesn't increase costs, at least as when you measure them in dollars. Obviously, it increases other costs. So what they're doing is pursuing, this is the liberals, they're pursuing policies which are going to increase health costs, but transfer them from taxpayers, which at least partially reaches the famous job creator, or shift them from them to the elderly. The same is true of course, there are more extreme proposals, like Rand Paul's, as you probably know, is backed by just about every Republican. It's studied by the Office of the Budget. They estimate it will add tens of trillions of dollars to costs, but transferred over to people who can't pay for it, elderly people. The same is true of poor people in general. The same is true of raising eligibility ages. So if you raise eligibility from 65 to 67, that doesn't much affect people like most of us. We tend to live longer. But if you're a blue-collar worker, it cuts off a big piece of your life. Construction worker, fireman, somebody who does hard physical work, your life is shorter. Those 2 years are 2 years less in which you can get decent care. But also raises health care costs, of course, for the same reason. It means you first shift from relatively efficient Medicare to hopelessly efficient private insurance costs, but not the deficit. On the radar screen is Social Security. This has nothing to do with the deficit. It's commonly discussed as part of the entitlements problem, but that's just a way to try to undermine Social Security. It's self-supporting, it doesn't contribute to the deficit, and it's in pretty good shape. It's in good shape for decades, in fact. With no social plans farther than that, and a little tweaking would keep it going forever. But Social Security has real problems, not financial problems. But one problem is it's of almost no significance to people who are relatively well off. Like I get Social Security, but I have a big pension because I worked at MIT for 55 years. So, yeah, Social Security's there, but it's kind of a statistical error. On the other hand, if you're a working person, or a disabled person, or something like that, Social Security can be your whole income. Particularly after the collapse of the asset bubble, the wealth bubble. People had their assets in their homes. That's gone. Among African Americans, for example, wealth is practically down to zero. These people survive on Social Security. So one problem is, well, it only works for the majority of the poor, working people. It doesn't work for the wealthy. So got to be able to come. So let's get rid of it's the principle on which Social Security is based. Social Security is based on the principle of solidarity. And that's a very dangerous principle. It means you might care about somebody else. You care about whether a disabled widow across town has food to eat. If you're a proper student of Ayn Rand and Alan Greenspan and so on, you know that it's her problem. She married the wrong person. The idea that you care about someone else is an extremely dangerous feature of a society which has to be driven towards total savagery, pure market capitalism, savage society. And if people have notions like sympathy and solidarity or interferences with these systems, so you got to cut them away and back on. It's kind of interesting because we're very far back. We go back to the early days of the Industrial Revolution, Eastern New England, 150 years ago. There was a very lively, vibrant free press at the time, much more than ever since. It included a labor press written by working people in factories, called factory girls, young women from the farms, Irish artisans from Boston and so on. And they were bitterly condemning the industrial system. They took it for granted that those who worked in the mills ought to own. We don't want managers, we don't want rulers. We're free Americans, we should own and run ourselves. The industrial system was taking away their intellectual culture, which was quite high. As we pointed out, that lasted a long time. I can remember in my childhood the one thing that they really condemned harshly was what they called the new spirit of the age in 1850. The new spirit of the age in 1850 is gain wealth, forgetting all but self. And that felt that they regarded as totally inhuman. I mean, it's taken over a century and a half to try to drive thoughts like that out of people's heads. And some steps towards it. But Social Security is one of the things that stands in the way. That says we don't care only about self, we care about other people too. I think the attack on public schools has essentially the same roots. Like, why should I pay for the schools in the town where I live? I think kids go to school. But we've got to somehow force those concepts into people's heads. There's been a battle for 150 years, and it's got to be a battle to prevent it. All undiscussed, going back to the deficit, there's something that's completely undiscussable, namely that there's an easy way out of the deficit. Everybody cares about the deficit. And it's not at all utopian. It's simply a shift to a healthcare system of the kind that every other industrial society has. Very popular idea. So, in fact, so for example, when Obama gave away the public option without a try, that was over the objections of a large majority of the population. When he made an arrangement with Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical corporation, to persist in this kind of outlandish concept unique to the United States that the government's not allowed to negotiate drug prices. About 85% of the population opposed it. But these things you can't, and in fact it is true that if we had a health system with the costs of other industrial countries, which were better than ours mostly, if we had that, we wouldn't have a deficit effect with the surplus. But that's undiscussable. It's not part of the debate. It infringes on the rights of insurance companies and pharmaceutical corporations. So if the press ever mentions it, which it rarely does, it says it lacks political support or it is politically impossible or something like that, which is correct in a system which doesn't even pretend to be a functioning democracy. Well, that's far from the only case of the chasm between public opinion and public policy, but it's worth, and I'll talk about something else, it's very important to recognize that there are other ways to undermine suppressing and ignoring public opinion, which is a rather dangerous way because it may lead to a reaction. A better way is just to control opinion, and that's often more effective. And there's some very striking examples right before our eyes today. I'll pick one that's of extraordinary significance because it's maybe the most serious issue in human history. It has to do with whether the species will even survive. So let me just review a couple of events of the past few weeks, which should have had screaming headlines in any functioning democratic society that would be able to mention. One of them, in fact, is, I'll come back to it. We start with November 28th, about a week ago. On November 28th, the International Durban Convention on Climate Change opened. It has a task. Its task is to try to carry forward the very limited earlier decision partially implemented. That's the UN Framework Convention of 1992 on the climate, and the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, as you know, the U.S. did sign it. Its first commitment period is just ending, and that's supposed to come up. There's a general mood here that was captured pretty effectively by the New York Times headline, urgent issues, low expectations. At the same time as the Durban Conference, and along with it, the international poll was taken by the leading polling agencies. I'll quote some of the results. Publics around the world, and even in the United States, say their government should give global warming a higher priority and strongly support multilateral action to address it. Also in the United States, as I said, but much less than elsewhere. U.S. concern about the threat has been declining over the last few years, so that American concern is significantly lower than the global average. Quote, Americans do not perceive that there is a scientific consensus on the need for urgent action on climate change. A large majority think that they're not being affected, and that's contrary to views in most other countries. Americans tend to underestimate the level of concern among other Americans. But none of this is accidental, and it's directly related to the decline of democracy resulting from dedicated efforts to control and manipulate opinion. Began with the successes of the insurance industry and big pharma to undermine any kind of moderate health care reform. And other industries were inspired by that. They quite openly, the energy-intensive industries announced openly that inspired by that, they were going to carry out huge propaganda campaigns by the major business lobbies like the Chamber of Commerce and to try to cast doubt on the near unanimous consensus of scientists on the threats of global warming, severe threat. Notice it's only near unanimous because there are two groups that don't agree. One of them is a very marginal group of climate change deniers. There is a fringe group on any topic in the physical sciences. Find some people who they don't agree. So there's a small group of deniers. But there's another group, a very large group, of people who don't agree with the consensus because they think it's much too optimistic. Well, they're out of the discussion. The standard media presentation is kind of, he says, she says, on the one hand, 98% of scientists, on the other hand, fringe of deniers. Omitted entirely from the discussion are the very substantial number of scientists, climate scientists, who say that it's just, it's much too optimistic. And they're probably right. I'll come back to that in a minute, but this is tremendous. All of these developments in the United States are quite a remarkable achievement of advertising and propaganda in a highly controlled democracy. And in this case, what's at stake is whether our grandchildren will have a world to live in. Well, the world is well aware that the United States government is dragging its feet on this issue. So the same polls say that publics around the world have, in recent years, have largely disapproved of how the United States is handling the problem of climate change. In general, the United States has been most widely seen as the country having the most negative effect on the world's environment, followed by China. Germany receives the best ratings. One way to gain some perspective on what's going on in the world is just to imagine yourself in the position of an intelligent extraterrestrial observer who's look at strange doings on Earth. But right now, the observer would just be watching in wonder as the richest, most powerful country in history is cheerfully leading the lemmings over the cliff. That's exactly what's happening. The International Energy Agency, it's no radical outfit, it was initiated on Henry Kissinger's initiative. It comes out with regular reports on carbon emissions. A couple of weeks ago, it came out with its latest report. It said they're rapidly decreasing. If it continues on its present course, by 2017, that's 5 years, the carbon budget will be exhausted. The carbon budget is the quantity of emissions that can keep global warming below 2 degrees centigrade rise, which is generally considered the limit of survival safety. 5 years away. The IEA chief economists say the door is closing. If we don't change direction now on how we use energy, we will end up beyond what scientists tell us is the minimum for likely survival, and the door will be closed forever, 5 years. A couple of days before that, the U.S. Department of Energy reported emissions figures for 2010. That jumped by the biggest amount on record. The level of greenhouse gases they reported is now higher than the worst case scenario that was anticipated by the IPCC, the main International Confederation of Scientists, just in 2007. It's now worse than the worst case scenario. The MIT has a major program on climate change. Its co-director, John Riley, pointed out that scientists have generally found the IPCC predictions to be too conservative, unlike the minor fringe of denialists who gain public attention. And he pointed out that the IPCC's worst-case scenarios were in the middle of the estimates of likely scenarios by the MIT climate specialists, and they're not unusual. Well, just as these predictions were being released within days, the London Financial Times devoted a full page to very optimistic expectations that the United States might become energy independent for a century with new technologies for extracting more fossil fuels. But if the U.S. might leapfrog Saudi Arabia and Russia to become the world's leading producer of liquid hydrocarbons, oil, and natural gas, and in this delightful event, the U.S. could expect to retain its global hegemony for a century. There are a couple of remarks scattered there about local ecological impact when they're declining water supplies. Nothing is said about what kind of a world will emerge from these exciting prospects. Well, that's pretty important. The Financial Times, as you may know, is not only the world's leading business daily, but it's one of the most sensible journals in the world. This is not the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal. I expect things like that. It's a serious journal. And they can write this in the middle of all these expectations coming out almost daily, getting not much publicity, but certainly no about them. And no cognitive dissonance. That's dangerous. Well, just about every government in the world is taking at least halting steps to do something about it. And the U.S. is indeed leading the pack, but backwards. That was part of the catechism of the Republican candidates, along with taxes, job creators, entitlements, and so on. And one of them is that there is no human-induced global warming drill, baby, drill. That's catechism. You have to keep to that if you want to be part of the game. And the Republicans in the House are now dismantling the measures which were introduced by the last Liberal president. Richard Nixon, if you remember, did introduce some climate control measures, EPA and other things. They're being dismantled. That's another indication of a very severe crisis of American democracy. It's a crisis for the whole world, for our grandchildren. Well, as I mentioned, the gap between public opinion and public policy in this case is not as great as it ought to be. And that's the most serious issue on the international agenda, maybe in history, because of control of public opinion. If you happen to read this morning's newspaper, you'll notice that there was another report by a group of scientists who monitored carbon emissions, which reiterated the conclusions of the U.S. Department of Energy 6 weeks ago, which barely were mentioned in the media. Well, going back to that extraterrestrial observer, I think they would be pardoned if they would conclude that we seem to be infected by some kind of almost lethal insanity. And it's institutional, it's not individual, which makes it a lot more significant. Well, unfortunately, it's not everyone. I haven't seen a poll in the Occupy movement, but I'm confident that if there was one, the polls would be like this, would be quite different. And there are some victories, small victories, but real. So the XL pipeline has been at least delayed, not for wonderful reasons necessarily, but it's with the help of property owners who don't want it in their backyard, but at least it's a victory, not and activism made a difference. Big demonstrations in Washington, a lot of people arrested and so on. Wrong basis, but anyway. And one of the major tasks of the Occupy movements is going to be, and not delayed, to try to reach out to the general public to counter the corporate propaganda that is, in this particular case, exactly the opposite of the internet of the scientific consensus. For example, the article in the Financial Times that I mentioned a lot like it. Well, that generalizes. Challenges ahead are very serious, cover a broad range. And once again, they're going to require solid, lasting organization. But one of the real achievements of the Occupy movement, exciting achievements, is that they have created a lot of bonds and associations among the participants. It's very significant in an atomized society like that, like ours, where there's just no tradition of working together. And people who gain experience forming communities that work, maintaining, sustaining them. And if that can be carried forward and translated into something broader, it could be real historic significance. And once again, the countless small actions of unknown people, it could become the foundation of great moments